When you work in the National Park Service for as long as I have, you learn that some assignments carry weight beyond what the paperwork suggests. I received the call on a Tuesday morning in late September, the kind of day when the Bethel wilderness was already turning copper and gold. The regional supervisor kept his tone level, professional, detached in that way administrators master after years of managing field staff who deal with things that do not fit neatly into incident reports. My name is Michael Williams. I have been a park ranger in the Alaska backcountry for 18 years. I have faced bears with cubs protecting their young, moose in the grip of seasonal aggression, and weather patterns that could reduce a person to statistics within hours. I have trained newer rangers in survival protocols, evacuation procedures, and the calculus of when to intervene and when to let nature run its course. I have written reports on every significant encounter, every unusual death, every anomaly that required documentation. But the call I received that September morning was different. The supervisor explained that a hiking group had gone missing near the Talakulaitna River. Not unusual in itself. Hikers disappear in Alaska with regularity that horrifies people who live in places where wilderness remains somewhat domesticated. But this group of 6 had not simply wandered off a marked trail or encountered an early storm. Their camp had been found in a state that prompted multiple agencies to involve themselves, which meant something about the scene had registered as strange even to the seasoned personnel who maintained these lands. I was told I would be meeting with Jessica Garcia, a wildlife assessment specialist, and Robert Wilson, an investigator from the regional office. We would spend the next week cataloging evidence, documenting conditions, and determining what had transpired. The supervisor did not use the word attack. He did not use the word predation. He simply said there were injuries consistent with something other than standard wildlife encounter, and the matter required careful documentation. The helicopter dropped me at a base camp near the river on a Wednesday morning. The sky hung gray and heavy, clouds pressing down on the landscape like a lid. The forest around Bethel in autumn carries a particular quality, a sense that the wilderness is beginning to remember something it had only half forgotten during the summer months. The trees were already losing leaves. The temperature had dropped below what most people would consider survivable without proper preparation. Jessica Garcia was waiting at the camp when I arrived. She was examining photographs spread across a portable field table, her expression the neutral mask that specialists develop when confronted with data that contradicts professional expectations. She had been working in wildlife management for 14 years and held certifications that placed her at the top of the field. She looked up as I approached, and I saw something shift in her eyes, a moment of hesitation that suggested she had been debating whether to show me the photographs immediately or wait for a formal briefing. She did not wait. The photographs showed a campsite that had been methodically dismantled, not destroyed, not ransacked, dismantled. The tents had been carefully opened, peeled back rather than torn. The sleeping arrangements had been examined. Food supplies had been sorted through with apparent deliberation. Equipment was scattered not in panic but in a pattern that suggested inventory, assessment, evaluation. Jessica explained that the initial response team had noted an absence of predatory violence at the site, which meant the conventional explanation of wildlife attack did not fit the evidence. But there were the bodies. She did not show me those photographs immediately. Instead, she walked me to the recovery site, about a quarter-mile from the main camp, on a slope that overlooked the river. The ground was already cold, frost forming in the early morning hours. The trees stood sentinel around us, and I became aware of something that would define the entire investigation: the absolute quiet. No birds, no distant calls of wildlife. Even the river seemed muted, as if the landscape itself was holding its breath. 3 of the 6 hikers had been found on that slope. 2 more were discovered in different locations over the following days. 1 was never recovered. The injuries on the bodies were not consistent with standard predator attack. They showed a particular kind of trauma that suggested immense strength applied with deliberate force, but without the feeding behavior associated with large predators. The bones had been broken in ways that required leverage and knowledge of joint anatomy. The patterns suggested something that understood how to cause maximum injury with minimum effort. Robert Wilson arrived the next morning with his team. He was a compact man of 47, with the bearing of someone who had spent significant time in military service before joining the investigative division. He reviewed the evidence without comment, asked precise questions, and made determinations that steered the official narrative toward bear attack, likely a defensive encounter where hikers had inadvertently approached a mother protecting cubs or territory. The injuries would be documented as consistent with bear trauma, adjusted for unusual severity, but attributable to a particularly aggressive animal. But Jessica and I exchanged glances when he made this determination, because we had both seen the photographs, and neither of us believed that explanation. That night, at the base camp, Jessica produced a set of photographs that had not been included in the official documentation. She had taken them independently before the official response team arrived. In these images, I could see something that the later photographs had been angled to minimize. The injuries on the bodies showed claw marks, but they were wrong, too large, too widely spaced. And alongside the claw marks, there were injuries that looked like they had been inflicted by something with fingers, with a gripping capacity that no bear possessed. I asked her if anyone else had documented this. She said no. She said that once Robert Wilson arrived and began steering the narrative, the other team members followed protocol and did not question his interpretation. But she had her professional reputation and her training, and she could not reconcile what she was seeing with the conclusion being recorded. I told her that until we understood what had actually occurred, we should continue gathering evidence and observing the landscape. I suggested that we expand our investigation beyond the immediate incident site. I recommended that we spend time in the wilderness around Bethel, learning its patterns, its animals, its particular ecological signatures. She understood what I was not explicitly saying. We would document what we could, and we would see what the landscape revealed. That decision committed us to the next phase of the investigation, the phase that would take us deeper into the wilderness than protocol suggested we should venture. That decision, made late on a cold night with only the tent walls separating us from the vast Alaskan landscape, set the trajectory for everything that would follow. The next morning, we began our expanded survey. The Bethel Wilderness spreads across terrain that human civilization touches only lightly. Towns exist on its periphery, places where supplies can be obtained and reports can be filed, but the interior remains largely as it existed before contact, shaped by weather and wildlife and forces that operate according to their own logic. Jessica and I spent the first week documenting wildlife sightings, examining tracks, cataloging the behavioral patterns of predators that might explain the incident. We found nothing that aligned with the official narrative. The bears in that region are substantial, powerful creatures capable of inflicting serious trauma. I have seen the evidence of their predation, the remains of moose and elk, the clearing of entire berry patches, the methodical way they navigate terrain seeking resources. But I have also learned to read their behavior, to understand the signatures they leave behind. The signature at the hiking incident site did not match the bears I knew. On the 8th day of our investigation, we discovered something that Robert Wilson had declined to document. It was a shelter, constructed from branches and vegetation, located on a ridge that overlooked both the initial campsite and the river valley beyond. The shelter was substantial, indicating considerable labor and planning in its construction. It was positioned in a location that would provide protection from wind, while offering clear sight lines across the landscape. Someone, or something, had built this shelter with purpose and knowledge of defensive positioning. Jessica photographed the shelter extensively before we disturbed it. We noted the size of the branches used in its construction, larger than a human would typically handle alone, some of them requiring leverage to position. The interior was lined with softer vegetation, a layer of bedding that suggested extended habitation. The overhang was high enough to accommodate something substantially taller than a human adult. I asked Jessica if she had seen anything in the incident documentation about structures or shelters. She confirmed that no one had documented this site. It was sufficiently far from the main campsite that it would not have been discovered in the standard investigation protocol. It was sufficiently well hidden that someone would need to know to look for it, or to stumble upon it by accident. That night, we remained in the area to observe if anything approached the shelter. We positioned ourselves upwind and maintained distance, watching through the darkness with equipment designed to capture thermal signatures. Nothing appeared. But we found evidence that something had visited the shelter recently. The bedding had been reorganized, Materials had been collected and stacked in the interior. And, most significantly, we found something that Robert Wilson would certainly have categorized as inadmissible evidence. It was hair. Long, dark, coarse hair that had been caught on the wooden frame of the shelter entrance. Jessica collected samples, following proper protocol for chain of custody and preservation. She photographed the location of each sample before collection, documented dimensions, and secured the evidence in labeled containers. We both understood that this evidence would not be included in any official report, but we also understood that it needed to be preserved. Over the following weeks, Jessica arranged for the hair to be analyzed through a private laboratory that she had contacts with. The results came back with findings that complicated every assumption we had been operating under. The hair was not bear. It was not elk, moose, or any standard North American predator. The laboratory technician suggested primate, though with unusual characteristics in the protein structure and pigmentation that did not perfectly align with any documented primate species. The closest match in their database was orangutan, which suggested something in the ape family, something not native to Alaska, something that should not exist in the region we were investigating. Jessica and I did not discuss these results extensively. We understood the implications. If we pursued this evidence through official channels, we would be destroyed professionally. Our careers would end in dismissal and discreditation. We would be classified as unreliable, as having let the stress of field work compromise our judgment. We would be permanently excluded from serious work in the Park Service. So instead, we continued our investigation outside the official framework, gathering evidence that would never be submitted, documenting findings that would never appear in any report. During this period, I encountered something that Robert Wilson had also declined to document, though for different reasons. I was surveying the broader region around Bethel, moving through terrain that required careful navigation and constant attention to weather and daylight hours. I came across tracks, and they were unlike anything I had encountered in my 18 years of work in the Alaskan wilderness. The tracks were bipedal. The stride length suggested something walking upright, with a leg length that exceeded human proportions. The foot structure showed a pattern consistent with something that could distribute weight across multiple points of contact, suggesting considerable size and mass. The tracks were preserved in a ridge of soft earth near a stream, and I was able to document the depth of impression. Something had passed through this location weighing significantly more than a human, something that moved with purpose and familiarity through terrain that challenged human navigation. I collected photographs and measurements and added them to the growing body of evidence that we were not investigating a standard predatory encounter. We were investigating something else entirely, something that existed in the documented wilderness but had never been formally acknowledged, something that the landscape knew but civilization had not cataloged. The official investigation concluded in late October. Robert Wilson filed his report categorizing the incident as a bear attack that had resulted in the deaths of 5 hikers and the disappearance of 1, presumed dead. The injuries were attributed to extreme predatory behavior prompted by territorial defense or protection of cubs. Recommendations were made for increased warning signage and expanded ranger patrols during late summer and early autumn months. The case was closed. Jessica and I continued our work through the official channels until early November, when we were reassigned to standard maintenance and observation duties. But we maintained our private documentation, our collection of evidence that existed outside the official record. We understood something that the official investigation had refused to acknowledge. Something was living in the Bethel wilderness. Something substantial. Something intelligent. Something that had deliberately separated and killed the members of the hiking party. That had examined their camp with purpose and deliberation. That had constructed shelters in locations of tactical advantage. That moved through the landscape with the knowledge of something that belonged there. And it was not finished. Winter came to Bethel with the particular intensity that defines high-latitude seasons. The temperatures dropped to levels that made standard outdoor survival nearly impossible. The darkness extended for longer periods each day. The landscape transformed into a place where human presence became almost irrelevant, where the concerns and technologies that dominated summer existence seemed quaint and insufficient. Jessica and I maintained contact through the winter, sharing observations and preliminary analysis of the evidence we had gathered. We continued to receive reports from other park rangers, routine documentation of wildlife activity, and environmental conditions. But embedded in those reports were anomalies that suggested the entity we had been investigating was not dormant. A ranger named William Rodriguez, 63 years old with 40 years of service in various Alaskan parks, submitted a report in early January describing unusual predation patterns. He had discovered the remains of what appeared to be a moose that had been killed with deliberate targeting of the Achilles tendon and the neck arteries. The kill pattern did not match wolf predation or bear behavior. It suggested something that understood anatomy and vulnerability, something that was hunting with a specific methodology. William made contact with me after submitting his formal report, aware that I had been involved in the earlier incident investigation. He shared details that he had deliberately omitted from the official documentation, details that aligned precisely with evidence Jessica and I had gathered. He had found claw marks near the kill site, marks that were too large and too widely spaced to fit any predator he was familiar with. He had followed tracks in the snow that showed bipedal movement, deliberate placement of feet, and stride length consistent with something considerably taller than human dimensions. William was not a man prone to speculation or imaginative interpretation. He was a ranger of the old school, someone who believed in observable facts and documented patterns. His willingness to contact me privately, his decision to share observations that contradicted official narratives, indicated that he had reached the same conclusion as Jessica and I. He had encountered evidence of something that should not exist in the Alaskan wilderness, something that was deliberately concealing itself while continuing to hunt. The three of us met in person in late January, at a neutral location outside the official park infrastructure. William brought additional documentation, photographs of tracks and predation patterns spanning several months. He explained that the anomalies he was observing had been occurring intermittently for several years, but they had escalated noticeably since the autumn incident that had prompted the hiking party deaths. He suggested that something had changed in the behavioral patterns, as if the entity had been emboldened or motivated by the encounter with the hikers. Jessica presented her analysis of the hair samples and the shelter photographs. William examined the documentation carefully, asked precise questions about collection methodology and preservation protocols, and then asked the question that all of us had been avoiding. What if this was not a single entity, but a population? The implications of that question shifted everything. We had been investigating as if we were dealing with an isolated anomaly, a single creature that had somehow migrated into the region or survived in hidden pockets of the wilderness. But if there was a population, then the incident in autumn was not unique. It was simply the first incident that had become visible enough to trigger an investigation. There might be others that had been dismissed or misclassified. There might be ongoing activity that had been systematically overlooked or explained away. William provided additional information that proved this hypothesis correct. Over the previous 5 years, there had been multiple incidents in the Bethel region and surrounding parks that had been classified as unusual, but not investigated intensively. A hiker had disappeared from a marked trail, her remains never found. An entire hunting party had reported sounds in the darkness that they described as non-animal, articulate, almost like speech patterns, but not human language. 2 park maintenance workers had encountered something in the forest that had caused them to abandon their assignment and request transfers to locations outside Alaska. When Jessica and I compiled all of this information chronologically, a pattern emerged that had been obscured by the deliberate separation and misclassification of individual incidents. The activity was concentrated in the region around Bethel, but it extended outward through the surrounding territories. The incidents followed seasonal patterns, increasing during late summer and autumn, decreasing during the winter months, but not ceasing entirely. The behavioral patterns suggested something that was learning, adapting, experimenting with new territories and new methodologies. We understood that we had moved beyond investigation into something more dangerous. We had moved into the territory of documentation of an unknown species that was actively occupying and hunting within the region we were responsible for monitoring. We had moved into the position of knowing something that official channels had rejected, of possessing evidence that contradicted the reassuring narratives that government bodies maintained for public consumption. The question became what to do with this information. Robert Wilson remained stationed in the Bethel region, overseeing the ongoing operations of the Regional Investigative Office. We knew that if we presented our findings to him, he would reject them as we had predicted he would reject them during the initial investigation. He would classify us as unreliable. He would initiate procedures to remove us from our positions. He would ensure that the evidence we had gathered would be discredited and dismissed. But there was another path forward. Jessica had contacts in academic circles, researchers who studied cryptozoology and documented sightings of unusual creatures that existed outside scientific consensus. William had relationships with independent conservation organizations that maintained their own investigative protocols. I had access to archival materials and historical records of park ranger observations going back decades, records that suggested this phenomenon was not new, but had been ongoing for longer than any of us had realized. We decided to compile a comprehensive documentation of everything we had gathered, everything William had observed, everything that the official investigation had obscured and rejected. We would create a record that was thorough, scientifically grounded, and irrefutable. We would preserve evidence in ways that could not be discredited by official channels. And we would determine, carefully and methodically, what steps we could take to ensure public safety without triggering the official response that would result in our dismissal and the suppression of all information we possessed. But this decision, made in the quiet of a winter evening, had consequences we could not foresee. Spring in the Bethel wilderness arrives like a revelation. The landscape that has been locked in ice and darkness for months suddenly erupts into movement and sound. The animals emerge from their winter dens and shelters, moving with the urgency of creatures reclaiming territory. The vegetation responds to lengthening daylight with growth that seems compressed in its speed. The weather patterns shift in ways that are sometimes violent and often unpredictable. Spring is when the Bethel wilderness is most alive, most assertive, most itself. It is also when the entity we were investigating became most active. Jessica and I expanded our fieldwork in March, taking advantage of the shifting season to pursue observations that had been impossible during winter. We moved through the landscape with greater frequency, documenting evidence and establishing sensor networks that would record activity without our physical presence. William contributed his own observations and access to historical documentation from the Regional Park Service archives, records that had been maintained but largely ignored by contemporary management. What emerged from this documentation was a pattern stretching back decades. There were reports from the 1970s describing unusual predation patterns, incidents that had been dismissed as misidentification or normal predator activity at the time. There were accounts from rangers in the 1980s mentioning sounds that were not identifiable as known wildlife, vocalizations that seemed almost structured, almost communicative. There were official incident reports from the 1990s detailing missing hikers and mysterious injuries that had been quickly classified and filed away. The pattern had been there all along, woven into the records, visible if anyone chose to look carefully. But documentation and observation were not sufficient for what we understood we needed to accomplish. We required direct evidence, material proof that could not be dismissed or reinterpreted through the lens of official skepticism. We required something physical and undeniable. In late April, we obtained that evidence. We had positioned tracking sensors in specific locations throughout our surveyed area, devices designed to capture images and thermal signatures of large animals moving through the landscape. Most of the triggers were generated by bears emerging from hibernation, moose moving to higher elevations, and natural phenomena that had nothing to do with our investigation. But on April 23rd, one of the sensors located near the shelter site captured something unmistakable. The footage showed a bipedal creature of substantial height, perhaps 8 to 9 feet tall based on the positioning relative to surrounding vegetation. The footage was brief, only a few seconds of movement through the sensor's field of view, but it was clear enough to show physical characteristics: large muscular build, long arms extending below the knees, movement that was efficient and purposeful. The creature was carrying something, what appeared to be portions of an animal carcass, suggesting that the predation patterns William had documented were being conducted with deliberate harvesting methodology. Jessica reviewed the footage multiple times, examining every frame, cross-referencing the movement patterns with the track documentation we had compiled. She consulted with the wildlife expert who had been secretly analyzing the hair samples and together they developed a preliminary assessment. The creature displayed characteristics consistent with Gigantopithecus blacki, a primate species that had been extinct for approximately 300,000 years. The footage suggested something that should not exist, something that could only exist if the scientific understanding of extinction events and prehistoric ecology was fundamentally incomplete. We did not attempt to explain this. We simply documented it and preserved the evidence with the kind of fastidious care that might eventually satisfy academic scrutiny. We kept backup copies of the footage in multiple secure locations. We ensured that the metadata could not be dismissed as fabricated or manipulated. We created a record that, if ever revealed, would fundamentally challenge the scientific understanding of species extinction and modern wildlife. But we also understood that revealing this evidence would be catastrophic. Robert Wilson would have the authority to declare the entire investigation invalid and our evidence inadmissible. Official channels would protect institutional credibility by discrediting our findings. Public revelation of undeniable proof that something impossible was occupying Alaskan wilderness would create panic, misguided hunting expeditions, and official responses that would likely result in the destruction of the entire population. So we continued our documentation in silence, gathering evidence that existed outside the official record, creating an archive that was thorough and preserved, but not yet revealed. During this period, Amanda Clark, one of the park maintenance workers who had abandoned her assignment the previous autumn, requested contact with me. She had transferred to a park in Idaho but had been following reports from the Bethel region. She was curious about what the official investigation had concluded, and she was troubled by the explanations that had been provided. She suspected that she had encountered the entity we were investigating, that the sounds she had heard and the presence she had felt on the abandoned work assignment had been something more than her supervisors had dismissed. Amanda was 46 years old and had worked in the Park Service for 20 years. She was not prone to imaginative interpretation or exaggeration. She was practical, grounded, and thoughtful in her professional approach. When she described what she had experienced on the day she abandoned her maintenance assignment, she was careful to distinguish between what she had directly observed, what she had heard, and what she had intuited based on instinct and years of experience in wilderness environments. She had been working with another maintenance worker, Ashley Martinez, on a trail repair project near a stream that ran roughly parallel to the location where the hiking party had been killed. They had been assessing trail conditions and planning the work required to restore damaged sections. During their survey, they had become aware of a presence in the surrounding forest. It was not immediately threatening, but it created a sense of being observed, of attention being directed toward them from the darkness of the forest edge. Ashley had wanted to continue the work, attributing the sensation to normal unease in an unfamiliar landscape. But Amanda had insisted that they leave the area. She described a moment when she heard what sounded like breathing, heavily labored, from a location that suggested something of considerable size in the forest near their position. She had not clearly seen whatever was producing the sound, but the implications had been sufficient to prompt her to gather their equipment and retreat to higher ground. Later that same day, they discovered that something had passed through their equipment cache, overturning containers and examining contents with deliberate precision. The chaos at the site was not consistent with animal predation, but rather with purposeful investigation and sorting. After this second encounter, both Amanda and Ashley had requested transfers, and neither had been willing to provide detailed documentation of what had occurred. Jessica and I arranged to meet with Ashley as well, and she provided corroborating information. She described the same sense of presence, the same carefully examined equipment cache, and the additional detail that she had observed what she thought was a footprint in soft earth near the stream. The footprint was large, substantially larger than any bear paw print, and structured in a way that suggested something with a distinct foot anatomy. We photographed Ashley's description of the footprint, obtained consent to include her account in our private documentation, and discussed the implications. Both women had encountered the entity we were investigating. Both had recognized the presence as something unusual and potentially threatening. Both had made the correct decision to retreat rather than escalate, and both had been rewarded with transfer assignments that removed them from the Bethel region entirely. By late April, our private documentation included photograph evidence, video footage, hair samples, track analysis, historical incident reports, and testimony from multiple experienced park professionals. We had created something that resembled a thorough investigative report, the kind of document that would be submitted in academic or law enforcement contexts. We had documented the existence of something that should not exist and provided evidence of its continued presence and activity. The question remained what to do with this information, and time was becoming a factor. Summer arrived in Bethel with the peculiar intensity that comes from the compressed season and the extended daylight. The entire landscape seemed to shift into urgent productivity. Everything bloomed, grew, reproduced, and matured within the window of favorable conditions. The weather became warmer, though still far from what most people would consider comfortable. The visibility expanded. The opportunities for observation and documentation increased. Jessica submitted her resignation from the Park Service in early June. She had secured a position with a private research organization that specialized in wildlife documentation and conservation. She explained to official channels that she wished to pursue work outside the governmental structure, seeking research opportunities that were not constrained by bureaucratic protocols and administrative limitations. Her resignation was accepted without notable resistance, and she transitioned away from official park operations. William remained in his position as a ranger, but he significantly reduced his field work and took on increased administrative duties. He explained that his age and the physical demands of active field work had begun to impact his performance. He requested transition to primarily office-based responsibilities focused on historical record maintenance and archive management. His request was approved, and he assumed duties that kept him within the infrastructure while reducing his visible field presence. I continued my work as an active ranger, maintaining my regular field assignments and documentation responsibilities. I was outwardly cooperative with official protocols and provided no indication that I had been involved in documentation outside the official record. But my observations expanded, and I began to encounter things that suggested the entity we were investigating was no longer primarily avoiding human contact. In late June, I documented a situation that was impossible to reconcile with standard interpretations of wildlife behavior. A hiking party had been moving through a remote section of the park when they encountered what they believed to be a bear. The bear was bipedal, standing upright as bears sometimes do in a brief moment of balance adjustment. The hikers described it as unusually tall, with long arms and a body structure that seemed wrong for standard bear anatomy. They had not been attacked, but they had been observed with an intensity that suggested deliberate assessment rather than casual wildlife notice. The hikers retreated carefully and did not return to the area. They reported the encounter to park rangers, and the report was filed as a sighting of unusual bear behavior, likely a male grizzly in a defensive posture. I reviewed the documentation and spoke privately with the hikers, and I understood that they had encountered something that would not be found if a search was conducted. They had seen what we had documented through tracks and shelter construction and captured footage. They had seen it clearly enough to recognize that something was wrong with the official explanation of bear encounter. These encounters were increasing in frequency. The entity that had remained largely hidden through autumn and winter was becoming more visible, more willing to be observed, more engaged with human presence in the landscape. Something had changed, and I could not determine whether it represented escalating confidence, deliberate revelation, or preparation for something more significant. I contacted Jessica and William in late July with information about the increasing visibility of the entity. We arranged a meeting at a location outside official park boundaries, a place where our communication would not be documented in any official capacity. Jessica had been analyzing the accumulated evidence with academic contacts, and she had determined that the footage and hair samples were consistent with documentation of similar creatures in isolated regions of North America dating back to the 19th century. The evidence suggested that the Bethel population was not unique, but rather one portion of a broader distributed population that had remained unknown and undocumented by mainstream science. William had been reviewing historical archives and had discovered references to encounters that predated the Park Service itself. Accounts from indigenous populations and early European explorers describing unusual creatures that inhabited the wilderness regions. The descriptions were consistent across centuries, suggesting something with genuine historical continuity rather than recent migration or escape from some unknown captive facility. I shared my recent observations about increasing visibility and the shifting patterns of encounter. I expressed my concern that something was about to change, that the relatively passive phase of documentation and observation was ending and being replaced by something we did not yet understand. Jessica proposed a hypothesis that we had been avoiding discussing explicitly. She suggested that the entities were not avoiding contact through avoidance in the traditional sense. They were conducting their own investigation of us, learning our behavioral patterns, understanding our capabilities and limitations, making determinations about whether we represented threat or opportunity. The increasing visibility was not accidents or careless moments, but deliberate moments of contact, controlled revelation designed to accomplish some specific purpose. The implications of this hypothesis were profound. If the entities possessed sufficient intelligence to conduct investigation and make strategic decisions, then we were not dealing with animals, even unusually intelligent animals. We were dealing with something that met the definition of sapient intelligence, something that thought in ways that might not be human but were clearly organized toward purpose and goal achievement. William raised the practical question that none of us wanted to address. If these entities possessed sapience and were deliberately revealing themselves at increasing rates, what were they preparing for? What objective could justify deliberate contact with humans when their survival advantage had depended on remaining hidden for so long? I did not have an answer to that question. None of us did. What I did understand was that our role as observers had reached its endpoint. The documentation we had compiled was comprehensive and irrefutable. The evidence was preserved in multiple secure locations, but documentation without action was simply a record of something witnessed, not something addressed. The increasing visibility suggested that time for passive observation was ending. We made the decision that we had deferred making since the initial investigation concluded. We decided that we would take the accumulated evidence to an academic institution that specialized in cryptozoology and biological documentation, an organization that had the credibility and resources to pursue rigorous research outside governmental oversight. Jessica had established relationships with specific researchers, individuals who had spent careers studying documented sightings of unusual creatures and developing frameworks for understanding their existence. But we understood that this decision was not without consequence. Once the evidence was released to external parties, we could not control how it was received, analyzed, or ultimately presented to broader audiences. We could not prevent public awareness of the Bethel entity or the implications of its existence. We could not protect ourselves from official response and career termination. We decided that the information was sufficiently significant that these personal consequences were acceptable. We began preparing the evidence for transfer, selecting materials that would provide sufficient foundation for research while preserving the most sensitive information for academic review under controlled conditions. We established protocols for secure transfer and arranged for Jessica to manage the initial contact with the research organization. We understood that once this process began, we would be irrevocably committed to paths that we could not reverse or withdraw from. But we also understood something else. The entity we had been investigating was sapient. It was intelligent. It was deliberate in its actions and strategic in its planning. And it was preparing for something. We were simply attempting to ensure that when that something arrived, the documentation of its existence would not be lost. August came to Bethel with weather that turned violent and unsettled. Storm systems moved through with frequency that disrupted normal outdoor operations. The Park Service implemented protocols restricting access to certain regions during periods of severe conditions. The landscape that had been so intensely alive during June and July seemed to turn inward, focusing on preserving resources against the approaching transition toward autumn and then winter. It was during one of these storm periods that something unexpected occurred, something that would force me to reconsider every assumption I had made about the nature of what we had been investigating. I had ventured into the wilderness during a brief window of improved weather, moving through an area that had shown evidence of entity activity. I was conducting what I believed would be one of the final documentation efforts before the evidence was transferred to external researchers. I was collecting additional track samples and examining shelter sites that had been established in the preceding weeks. The storm arrived more quickly than forecasts had predicted, moving in from the southwest with intensity that suggested I had made a misjudgment in assessing weather conditions. The wind increased to levels that made forward progress difficult. The precipitation shifted from rain to sleet to snow with shifting intensity. Visibility contracted to perhaps 30 feet, and I realized I had moved beyond the range where returning to the established camp was a realistic option given the speed and severity of the conditions. I moved into a dense grove of trees that provided some shelter from the wind and began creating a weather shelter using materials at hand. This was not the first time I had found myself in survival conditions during fieldwork, and the protocols were automatic, efficient, directed toward preserving core body temperature and waiting for conditions to improve. As I was creating the shelter, I became aware of activity in the surrounding forest. Something was moving, deliberately and with purpose, through the storm conditions that would have sent most animals to shelter. The movement patterns suggested something substantial, something that moved with familiarity through the landscape despite the severe weather. I positioned myself within the shelter structure, waiting to determine what was approaching. A form emerged from the snow and wind, coalescing from the gray chaos into something with recognizable shape. It was one of them. The entity that we had documented through tracks and shelters and fragmented footage was now physically present, separated from me by perhaps 20 feet of exposed space, directly observable in lighting conditions that allowed clear visual confirmation. I should have been afraid. Every instinct born from survival training should have prompted me to defensive positioning or attempted escape. But I was frozen in place, not from fear, but from the magnitude of what I was actually perceiving. The entity was real. The documentation we had compiled was not theoretical or interpretive, but rather evidence of something that existed in the most concrete sense possible. The entity looked at me. I understood in that moment that this was not an accidental encounter. Not a coincidence of location and timing, but something deliberate. The entity had positioned itself where I would find it. It had arranged conditions that would force an encounter. It had waited for me specifically. The entity was approximately 9 feet in height, with a body structure that possessed both ape-like and uniquely other characteristics. Its musculature was massive, built for strength and leverage rather than for speed. Its arms extended past its knees, with clearly articulated fingers and an opposable thumb structure. Its face carried features that seemed to blend simian characteristics with something more, something that suggested cognitive capacity and emotional complexity. Its eyes were dark and direct, and they conveyed something that I had never encountered in the gaze of an animal: intelligence. Deliberate, purposeful, complex intelligence. The entity made a sound, a vocalization that was not a simple growl or call, but something structured, something that carried variation and pattern. It was not human speech, but it possessed the quality of communication, of purposeful transmission of meaning through structured vocalization. The entity repeated the vocalization, varying the tones and patterns, seeming to observe how I responded to each variation. I realized what was happening. The entity was learning my language. It was examining my responses to sound patterns and attempting to develop its own production of structures that would create recognition or response from me. It was conducting exactly the kind of deliberate investigation that Jessica had hypothesized weeks before. I attempted to create a vocalization in response, something that might convey peaceful intent and willingness to communicate. The entity watched me with what appeared to be fascination, its eyes tracking my mouth movements and listening to the sounds I produced. When I finished my attempted communication, it made another sound, this one somewhat closer to approximations of human phonetic patterns, as if it had made an attempt to match my vocal production. We stood facing each other in the storm, two creatures representing different orders of primate and different evolutionary paths, attempting something like communication across a gap that millions of years had created. The storm continued around us, wind and snow creating isolation from anything beyond the small clearing where we stood. I became aware of other presences in the surrounding forest. The storm was providing cover for movement, and I could sense rather than see additional entities positioned in the trees around us. The one before me was not alone, and the others were observing this encounter. I understood that I was not in immediate danger, that the entity before me was not positioned for attack. The encounter was controlled, observed, deliberately managed. The entity made another vocalization, this one carrying more complex pattern than the previous attempts. I understood that this was not random behavior, but purposeful communication, deliberate attempts to convey meaning. The entity was not simply investigating me, but attempting to establish connection, to create some form of understanding between us. I spoke slowly and clearly, using simple phrases and allowing extended time between vocalizations for the entity to process and respond. I explained that I understood the entity to be intelligent, that I recognized the significance of this encounter, that I understood this moment to be important in ways that extended beyond immediate threat or attack. I attempted to convey respect and acknowledgement of the entity's intelligence and capacity. The entity watched me throughout this communication, making occasional sounds that seemed to respond to specific elements of what I was saying. When I finished, the entity was quiet for a moment, and then it made a sound that was unmistakable in its intent. It was a question. The entity was asking me something, seeking information or understanding about something specific. I did not fully understand what the question was, but I understood that the entity had progressed beyond simple investigation to something more complex. It wanted to know something about me, about humans, about the situation we were existing in together in this remote wilderness during a storm. I attempted to answer, explaining that I had been documenting evidence of the entity's presence, that I had gathered information about the incidents and encounters that had occurred in the region, that I was planning to share this information with external researchers who might be able to help establish appropriate coexistence between human society and the entity population. The entity's response was dramatic. The vocalizations became more complex, carrying tones that suggested agitation or urgency. The entity looked toward the forest where the other presences were waiting, and the other entities seemed to respond to whatever communication was occurring between them. The entity before me looked back at me and made a series of vocalizations that were emphatic and clearly laden with meaning that I could not fully interpret, but I understood the essential message. The entity did not want external attention. The entity was not interested in being the subject of research or documentation by academic institutions. The entity wanted its existence and its territory to remain unknown and undocumented. I attempted to explain that the information would be handled carefully, that the researchers could be trusted to maintain ethical standards and respect the entity's privacy and autonomy. But the entity made a gesture that was unmistakable in its meaning, a gesture that conveyed rejection of this entire framework. The entity was telling me that the documentation could not occur. The evidence would have to be destroyed. The knowledge that I had gathered would have to be surrendered. The entire investigation would have to end, not with transfer to external researchers, but with absolute termination and silence. I understood then what had been occurring. The entity had been learning about us, but not primarily to determine whether we could coexist. The entity had been learning about us to understand what we knew and what we would do with that knowledge. The entity had been making determinations about how to protect itself and its population from external exposure and disruption. The increasing visibility that had marked the preceding months was not preparation for revelation. It was investigation and assessment of the specific humans who possessed knowledge of the entity's existence. Specific humans who could be located and confronted with ultimatums before they could share their documentation with broader audiences. The storm had provided cover for this confrontation, and the entity had known exactly where I would be and when I would be vulnerable. I was facing an intelligence that was not primitive or reactive, but sophisticated and strategic. I was facing something that had made a deliberate calculation that my knowledge was a threat that needed to be addressed. I was facing the moment when the documentation investigation would end, either with my compliance or with my removal from the equation entirely. I made a decision in that moment. A decision that came from survival instinct and from understanding the fundamental stakes of the situation. I nodded. I made the gesture of agreement and surrender. I conveyed that I understood the entity's requirement, that I accepted the mandate for silence and destruction of evidence. I explained that I would cease my documentation efforts, that I would retrieve the evidence from external parties, that I would ensure complete destruction of all material I had gathered. The entity watched me for a long moment, and then it made a series of vocalizations that seemed to carry finality. The entity turned and moved into the storm, and the other presences in the surrounding forest seemed to withdraw as well. Within moments, I was alone in the clearing. the storm continuing its assault on the landscape, my weather shelter half constructed and insufficient for the conditions. I finished the shelter and waited out the storm. When conditions improved enough to allow travel, I made my way back to the base camp. I did not immediately contact Jessica or William. Instead, I spent several days processing what I had experienced, reconsidering what the encounter meant and what obligations I now carried. The entity was sapient. The entity was intelligent. The entity was capable of conducting sophisticated investigation and making strategic decisions. But the entity was also terrified of human knowledge and the implications that human documentation could create. The entity understood that scientific revelation of its existence would trigger responses that could destroy the population entirely. I realized that the entity was right. Academic documentation and public knowledge would create pressure for organized investigation and capture. Governments would become involved. Hunting expeditions would be organized. Protective barriers would be established. The entire situation would spiral into conflict and, almost certainly, termination of the entity population. The entity had made a calculation that secrecy was essential for survival. The entity had acted on that calculation by confronting the specific humans who possessed knowledge. The entity had created an ultimatum that required absolute silence. I contacted Jessica and told her that I could no longer participate in the documentation transfer. I explained that my understanding of the situation had changed, that I now believed that the entity's privacy and autonomy had to be protected as absolutely as any human populations would be protected. I told her that the evidence would have to be destroyed, that the documentation would have to be terminated, that we would have to accept that some knowledge was too dangerous to preserve. Jessica wanted to argue, wanted to explain why scientific understanding was important and why documentation of a sapient species was ethically imperative. But I told her about the encounter, about the entity's clear communication of its requirements, about the understanding that the entity would take whatever steps were necessary to prevent external exposure. Jessica chose to honor my judgment. She contacted the research organization and withdrew her initial offer of documentation transfer, citing changed circumstances and ethical concerns about invasion of privacy for a previously unknown sapient species. She destroyed all evidence that had been transferred to her control. William, when I informed him, did not argue or question the decision. He had been an investigator for long enough to understand that sometimes the appropriate conclusion to an investigation was not revelation but silence. He helped coordinate the destruction of all archival documentation and records that we had assembled. He retired from the Park Service 3 months later, citing age and desire to pursue other interests. I continue to work as a ranger in the Bethel region. I continue to observe and document wildlife activity through official channels. I continue to submit reports on predation patterns and habitat conditions, but I no longer maintain private documentation of the entity. I no longer attempt to prove its existence or contribute to its exposure. I have learned to see the landscape differently since the encounter in the storm. I understand now that the wilderness of Bethel is not empty or lonely. I understand that something intelligent and purposeful inhabits this place, something that is watching and observing just as I am watching and observing. I understand that we have reached an accommodation, of sorts, a mutual agreement to coexist within the same landscape without the necessity of external revelation or confrontation. Sometimes during my field work, I hear vocalizations that are not quite birdsong and not quite animal call. Sometimes I find shelter sites that could not have been constructed by any creature that official recognition acknowledges exists. Sometimes I discover tracks that suggest something walking upright through territory that should be empty. And I understand that I am not alone. I understand that the Bethel wilderness is inhabited by an intelligence that has made a choice about silence and secrecy. I understand that this intelligence will defend that choice with whatever force is necessary. I understand that the only ethical response to this knowledge is acceptance and silence. The entity showed me in that storm that existence does not require external validation. Intelligence does not require documentation. A species does not need scientific recognition to possess value and rights. Some knowledge, once obtained, creates responsibility. Some truths, once understood, demand protection rather than revelation. This is the truth I carry now. This is the knowledge I have been given and must protect. This is why I am telling this story. Not as proof, not as evidence, not as documentation for academic examination, but as testimony to something that exists, something that matters, something that has chosen to reveal itself to me and ask for silence in return. I have honored that request. I will continue to honor that request. And in the Bethel wilderness, that request is enough. That is all that remains. My name is Christopher Anderson, and I spent 22 years as a ranger across various protected lands in Alaska. This account documents events from the autumn of 2019 in the Kotzebue region. What follows are my personal observations, compiled from field notes, equipment recordings, and conversations with colleagues who were present during our tenure. I am compelled to share this because silence feels like complicity, and those who come after me deserve to know what dwells in the spaces between civilization and wilderness. Before you listen further, I encourage you to subscribe to Sir Bellico and Mr. Bellico for more narratives that challenge what we think we know about the wild places. Like and comment below if you believe the lands beyond our maps hold secrets we are only beginning to understand. The following account has been reorganized for clarity, but every detail is drawn from what we witnessed. Every detail is what we saw. I arrived in Kotzebue on the second week of September, when the light still held its summer stubbornness, but the air had begun to hint at the cold that would eventually consume everything. My supervisor had called me 3 weeks prior with the assignment. A new park designation meant new oversight protocols. They needed someone with my background, someone who had spent enough time in the wild to not jump at shadows, but enough in civilization to file reports that made sense to bureaucrats. My temporary base was a ranger station built in the early 1990s. Solid enough, but showing the kind of wear that comes from harsh seasons and limited maintenance budgets. Lauren Thomas, the station manager, had been there for 8 years. She was 61, with the kind of weathered competence that comes from someone who genuinely loves the work rather than merely tolerates it. We spent the first afternoon reviewing park boundaries, visitor protocols, and equipment inventories. The station had 3 permanent staff, including Lauren. I would be conducting the autumn survey, a rotation that normally took 6 weeks. Daniel Taylor was the second permanent ranger, a methodical man of 50 who specialized in wildlife counts and ecosystem monitoring. Rachel Moore handled the administrative side, scheduling, supply management, and visitor outreach. She was 35 and brought an enthusiasm to the work that seemed almost performative in its intensity, as though she was constantly proving something to herself. Matthew Jackson arrived the following week, brought in as additional support for the expanded survey season. He was 42, with the particular manner of someone who had worked multiple ranger positions across different states and wore that experience like a credential. Nicole Martin, the newest addition, was 58 and had transferred from a position in the lower 48. She seemed perpetually uncertain about Alaska, as though questioning what choices had led her there. On my 3rd day, Lauren took me on a boundary walk. We covered approximately 12 miles, moving along the perimeter markers that delineated the protected area from the surrounding lands. The weather held clear, and the terrain was manageable. A mix of tundra vegetation, scattered dwarf willow, and areas of exposed stone. Kotzebue itself was several miles to the west, visible only as a thin line of structure and smoke on the distant horizon. Halfway through our walk, Lauren pointed to a section of tundra that looked to me like every other section of tundra we had passed. I asked her what I was meant to see. She said that visitors had reported disturbances in that area. Not aggressive incidents, she clarified, but strange patterns. Vegetation pressed flat in roughly circular areas, scattered remains of caribou and moose, arranged in ways that did not match natural predation patterns. She had filed reports on 5 separate incidents over the past 18 months. I asked if bears were common. Abundant, she said, but these markings did not fit bear behavior. She could not explain what made them different, only that her instincts said something was present that she did not have categories for. We continued walking, and I filed the information away without placing particular weight on it. I had worked enough wilderness assignments to know that perception and pattern recognition could deceive, that humans were wired to find meaning in random elements, to construct narratives from scattered evidence. This was standard ranger work, the documentation of anomalies that usually resolved into mundane explanations. That evening, back at the station, Daniel pulled me aside. He had overheard Lauren discussing the boundary walk. He wanted to show me something. He opened a locked cabinet in the equipment room and withdrew a folder containing photographs. They were field images, the kind taken with a handheld camera, slightly out of focus in some cases, clearly documenting specific locations. The first showed the pressed flat tundra vegetation Lauren had mentioned. The images progressed through a sequence, more examples of the flattened areas, remains of animals scattered across the ground, and then, in the fourth photograph, something that made me stop the progression. The image showed deep gouges in stone, not scratches, which I would have understood as bear signs. These were systematic, parallel gouges, as though something had pressed its weight down into rock and drawn its points through the stone. The marks were fresh. The surrounding stone showed no weathering. I asked Daniel how recent the photograph was. 3 weeks prior, he said, and he had returned to the site last week. The gouges had deepened. This was the first genuine concern I felt, though I would not have admitted it at that moment. Deepening gouges suggested not just repeated presence but persistent activity, something that was not moving through the landscape but returning to specific locations. I asked if he had documented this in the official reports. His response was a long pause. Then he said that Lauren had advised against it, not because the phenomena were not real, but because the reports would trigger protocols that would bring officials from outside the region, media attention, and ultimately nothing productive. Daniel did not seem to agree with this choice, but he was not the station manager. Over the following week, I began my own documentation. I moved through the park systematically, establishing observation points, conducting wildlife counts, and recording environmental data. It was during this work that I first found evidence myself. I was conducting a survey in an area approximately 4 miles northeast of the station when I encountered signs of something massive. The area was a stretch of tundra, bordered by exposed rock formations. What caught my attention was a series of prints in a soft patch of ground where snowmelt had created a muddy depression. The prints were large, not unusual in itself, given that moose ranged the region. But the spacing between prints suggested something moving on 2 legs, not 4. The stride length was extraordinary, covering ground in a way that did not match any animal I could identify. The impression itself was unclear, mud not holding detail well, but the sheer size of the depression suggested significant weight, concentrated in a narrow point of contact. I photographed the prints from multiple angles, recorded GPS coordinates, and established markers to return for follow-up documentation. As I was completing this work, I became aware of something I can only describe as a presence, not a sound, not a movement I could point to definitively, but a sense of attention, as though something in the visible landscape was aware of my awareness, and the distance between observer and observed had collapsed into simultaneity. I gathered my equipment and moved back toward the station at an accelerated pace. I did not run, because running felt like acknowledgement of something I was not prepared to acknowledge, but I moved with purpose, and I did not look backward. That evening, I reviewed the photographs on my computer. The prints were clear enough in the images. I did not sleep well. In the morning, I hiked back to the location. The prints had been disturbed, the mud worked over and mixed into an unrecognizable pattern. Something had returned to the site and obscured the evidence. I sat at the station that afternoon and drafted a report. I documented the observation, the photographs, and the subsequent disturbance. I did not attempt to identify what creature might have left such marks, only that they required investigation. Before submitting it, I showed it to Lauren. She read through it carefully, then asked me directly whether I was prepared for the consequences of filing this report. Not consequences for me specifically, but for the park, for her position, for the community around Kotzebue. I told her the consequences of not reporting were potentially greater. She nodded, as though she had expected this answer, and told me to send it. The bureaucratic response to my report was surprisingly swift. Within 5 days, I received correspondence indicating that investigators from the Regional Environmental Office would be arriving within 2 weeks to conduct an assessment. In the interim, I was instructed to expand my documentation efforts and avoid any activities that might disturb potential evidence. Daniel seemed relieved by this development. Matthew Jackson was less certain. I overheard a conversation between him and Nicole in the equipment room where Matthew expressed concerns about what bringing outside attention might provoke. I did not hear Nicole's full response, but I gathered she shared his apprehension. During those 2 weeks of waiting, the activity escalated. On the 8th day after filing the report, Rachel discovered that supplies from one of the remote caches had been disturbed. The cache was located approximately 6 miles from the station, positioned along a hiking trail frequented by visitors. The metal container had been opened, not forced, but somehow separated from its locking mechanism. Food items were scattered across the ground in a pattern that suggested not feeding but investigation. Nothing appeared to have been consumed, only sorted, examined, and discarded. Rachel had been attempting to minimize the significance of this incident until Matthew pointed out that the container was affixed to a wooden platform elevated 4 feet off the ground. Whatever had opened it would have needed to reach upward and manipulate the mechanism with precision. The following day, I hiked to the cache location. I photographed the container, examined the locking mechanism for signs of tampering, and investigated the surrounding area for tracks or disturbance patterns. The ground around the cache was hard, mostly exposed rock, which limited the impression of prints. But scattered across the area were pieces of vegetation, plant matter that had been crushed and torn apart with what seemed like deliberate force. The destruction was extensive, far more than would result from casual feeding. As I was photographing this destruction, I noticed something that made me pause. Arranged among the scattered plant matter were animal bones, small rodent remains, placed in patterns that seemed almost deliberate. I documented the arrangement, attempting to capture the spatial relationship of each piece. There was no logical predation reason for this arrangement. It appeared to be intentional organization, the placement of objects with purpose. I returned to the station and found Daniel in the records room. I asked if he had observed similar patterns in his documentation, if the scattered remains he had photographed showed evidence of intentional arrangement. He had not viewed it that way initially, he said. But once I drew his attention to the possibility, he began to see it in the photographs he had collected. The remains he had assumed were scattered randomly now appeared to follow spatial logics that did not match natural predation or scavenging patterns. This was a significant observation, because it suggested not just the presence of something large and powerful, but something with capacity for intentional behavior beyond basic feeding or territorial marking. It suggested cognition. That night, I lay awake in the small room I had been assigned at the station. The building was quiet, the kind of quiet that exists in isolated locations where external noise is genuinely absent. I listened to the silence and considered the possibilities. Bear behavior could not account for what we were documenting. No known predator in the region matched the scale and sophistication of the disturbances we were recording. I did not want to think the thoughts I was thinking, because they felt like capitulation to the kind of speculative thinking that had made me skeptical of others' claims in the past. But the evidence was accumulating in a specific direction, and I had trained myself too long in observational methodology to ignore patterns, simply because they led to uncomfortable conclusions. The morning of the 12th day after filing the report, Rachel arrived at the station, appearing deeply unsettled. She had been returning from Kotzebue after restocking supplies, driving alone as she did most weeks. Approximately halfway between town and the station, at a point where the road passed through relatively open terrain, she had observed something crossing the road ahead of her. Her description was hesitant and imprecise. She was uncertain how much of what she had seen was actual observation and how much was her brain constructing narrative from peripheral impressions. She remembered a massive shape, bipedal, moving across the road at what seemed like deliberate pace rather than flight. The coloring was dark, the proportions extended and powerful. The crossing had taken perhaps 3 seconds, she estimated, but the presence of whatever she had seen filled her awareness completely. She had stopped the vehicle immediately after it crossed the road. She sat in the car for an unknown amount of time, she said, attempting to process what she had witnessed. When she had finally felt capable of continuing, she had driven directly to the station without stopping. Lauren took Rachel's account seriously, but not with panic. She moved through a protocol of questions, asking Rachel to describe size, movement, any details that might help identify what she had seen. Rachel struggled to provide specifics beyond her initial description. Fear had not served to sharpen her memory. It had instead created a kind of protective fog in her mind, keeping the full image from forming clearly. Matthew asked if it might have been a bear standing bipedally. Rachel said the movement had been too coordinated for that. It had not been a bear on hind legs. The entire configuration of the body had been bipedal, balanced and sure. That afternoon, I drove the route Rachel had traveled and examined the location where she had reported seeing the crossing. The terrain on either side of the road consisted of open tundra and patches of willow. The creature would have had to move across the open ground to reach the road. I searched for tracks or crushed vegetation but found nothing conclusive. The ground was hard, and the light was failing as I completed my search. But as I was returning to the vehicle, I discovered something that Rachel would not have seen from the road. Off to the north side, approximately 100 yards from the road's edge, there was a depression in the ground forming an irregular circle. The vegetation inside the circle had been pressed flat, as though something massive had rested there, and the pattern of the flattening suggested the weight distribution of something with an extended body resting on the ground. The material inside the depression still held moisture, which meant it had been relatively recent. Within the past few days, certainly. I photographed the depression, recorded coordinates, and returned to the station to relay this information to Lauren. The investigators from the regional office arrived the following afternoon. There were two of them, a man named David Chen and a woman named Maria Gutierrez, both with environmental investigation background, but neither appearing particularly credulous toward what we had documented. They conducted interviews with the staff, reviewed my reports and photographs, and examined the physical evidence I had collected. Their assessment, delivered after 3 days of investigation, was that we were dealing with misidentification and pattern recognition bias. The tracks I had documented could be explained by a combination of bear prints and human impression. The cache disturbance was consistent with bears accessing the container. Rachel's road crossing observation was consistent with a moose moving rapidly across the highway, with fear and darkness creating a distorted impression. The remains arrangements, they suggested, could be attributed to natural processes, the sorting of bones by scavengers, wind movement, and decay patterns that created the appearance of intentionality without actual design. They filed a report recommending that we implement standard protocols for securing remote caches and advised that we increase wildlife education for visitors to reduce fear-based misidentifications. I watched this assessment being delivered and found myself silent, not because I agreed with their conclusion, but because I had reached a point where arguing the opposite seemed to serve no purpose. They had come with a predetermined framework for understanding the situation, and no amount of evidence could reshape that framework. They were invested in the belief that the wilderness operated according to known parameters, that all phenomena could be reduced to identified species and understood behaviors. On the day they departed, Daniel pulled me aside. He showed me something he had not shared with the investigators. It was a series of photographs he had taken over the preceding weeks, images he had been accumulating privately. They documented not just disturbance patterns, but something else, something that required specialized photography to capture. In several of the photographs, there appeared to be hair fibers, dark and coarse, caught on vegetation near the disturbance sites. Daniel had collected samples, preserving them in sealed containers. He had not sent them for analysis because he knew what the response would be. The material would be identified as bear hair or vegetation or some other mundane substance, and the investigation would end. But looking at the samples with Daniel, examining them under the magnification of a handheld lens, I could see the structure of the fibers. They did not match any bear specimen I had examined in training. They were longer, thicker, with a different pattern of growth and pigmentation. I asked Daniel what he believed we were looking at. He said he did not know, but he was certain we were looking at something that did not fit the categories we had been taught to recognize. He asked if I would help him conduct a parallel documentation, an unofficial investigation that did not go through official channels. I told him yes. For the remainder of September and into the first weeks of October, Daniel and I conducted systematic observations throughout the park. We established observation points at locations where we had documented previous disturbances, and we maintained surveillance during periods when activity seemed most likely. The pattern we discovered was one of cyclical presence, not constant but recurring on what appeared to be a 7 to 10 day cycle. During nights when the cycle suggested activity was probable, we would position ourselves in observation areas and wait. Most of these vigils produced nothing beyond the standard wildlife activity of the region: owls hunting, foxes moving through the brush, the distant sounds of distant herds moving across the tundra. But on 3 separate occasions, we witnessed something that did not fit these patterns. The first sighting came on a night when the new moon had left the sky particularly dark. We were positioned at an observation point overlooking a valley that had shown multiple disturbance sites. We had arrived at dusk and settled into position as the light faded completely. The temperature was dropping, already near freezing, and we maintained vigilance despite the cold seeping into our bodies through the ground. At approximately 2 in the morning, I heard movement to our north, the sound of something moving through the willow brush with a confident stride. Daniel heard it too. I could sense his heightened attention, the shift in his breathing. We did not move. We remained positioned, and we listened. The sound of movement approached our location. I could hear the vegetation being pushed aside, the systematic displacement of air that comes from something large moving through space. But I could not see anything. The darkness was complete enough that even with my eyes adapted to the low light, the form of whatever was moving remained invisible to me. The movement stopped. I realized we had stopped breathing. The absence of our exhalation seemed suddenly profound, as though that small sound might be the difference between remaining undetected and triggering a response. I do not know how long the cessation lasted. Seconds expand in darkness and fear. It might have been 10 seconds. It might have been a minute. Time loses its granularity in those moments. Then the movement resumed, moving to the east, past our position and away into the deeper darkness. The sound of its passage gradually diminished until silence reasserted itself, and we were alone with the night. Daniel and I did not speak immediately. We remained in position until the first hints of dawn began to lighten the eastern sky. We waited until enough light had returned that we could see the landscape clearly before we moved, and attempted to locate tracks or other evidence of what had passed so close to us. The ground where the sound had stopped was tundra and exposed rock. We found no prints, no crushed vegetation, nothing that marked the presence of the creature we had heard. It was as though the entire encounter existed only in the realm of sound and perception, with no physical evidence to validate its occurrence. On our return to the station, we did not discuss the encounter with the other staff. We both understood that sharing what we had witnessed would only invite further investigation and dismissal. We filed it away as part of our parallel documentation, evidence that existed in our observations and nowhere else. The second encounter came 10 days later. This time, Rachel and Nicole were involved, though neither of them was seeking the encounter. They had been conducting a hiking survey to inventory vegetation changes in a northern region of the park. They were returning to the station in the late afternoon when they became aware that something was following them. Rachel described it as a presence that registered not as sight but as attention. She became aware that they were being tracked, observed, evaluated by something that maintained a distance but did not break the connection between watcher and watched. Nicole did not perceive the presence initially. Rachel had to point out the direction from which she felt the observation originating before Nicole became aware of it. Once aware, they attempted to increase their pace back toward the station. They did not run, both later saying that running felt like an acknowledgement of threat they were not prepared to make. But they moved quickly. The sense of being followed persisted. They could hear movement paralleling their course, staying at a distance that did not close but did not increase either. It was only when they reached the station that the presence withdrew. Rachel described looking back toward the point from which they had come and seeing nothing, yet knowing with absolute certainty that whatever had been following them had turned away and moved back into the landscape. Matthew and I took the account seriously. We hiked out to the location where Rachel and Nicole had reported first sensing the presence. The route they had taken was well defined, and we were able to establish the specific locations from which they were hiking. On the northern side of their travel route, at a distance of approximately 50 yards, We found a position that offered clear observation of the entire hiking path. This position held multiple signs of recent occupation. The ground was flattened in a roughly circular pattern. Vegetation around the area was crushed and broken, and most significantly, we found additional hair samples, consistent with those Daniel had been collecting. But there was something else at this location. To the east of the occupation area, we found a series of tree branches arranged in a pattern. These were not broken or knocked down, but deliberately positioned, laid across each other in a formation that created a structure resembling a rough shelter or marker. The arrangement was too precise to be accidental. I documented the location thoroughly, collecting additional hair samples and photographing the constructed formation from multiple angles. As I was completing this work, a feeling of profound dislocation overtook me. This was not something that fit the framework I had been trained to operate within. This was not animal behavior as I understood it. This was something more. That evening I sat with Daniel and Rachel in the equipment room, away from the other staff. I asked them directly what they believed we were dealing with. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Rachel said the word that everyone had been avoiding. Bigfoot, not in the manner of tabloid speculation or folklore superficiality, but as a designation for something that was present in the landscape, that was conducting itself with intention and cognition, that was aware of us and our activities. Daniel did not disagree. He had been moving toward this conclusion through his documentation. The evidence had been accumulating in this direction, he said, and he could no longer force it into categories that did not fit. I told them that naming it as such changed nothing and everything. It changed nothing in the sense that the phenomenon remained the same. It changed everything because it collapsed the safe distance between us and what we were documenting. It made real a thing that was meant to be folklore, dismissible, unreal. We agreed that we would intensify our documentation efforts, but would not expand our knowledge of this situation to the rest of the staff. I told them what happened next would be determined by the creature's behavior and our capacity to respond to escalation. In the final week of October, the activity pattern shifted. Instead of the 7 to 10 day cycle of presence and absence, the disturbances began to occur with increasing frequency. We documented activity on 5 separate occasions over a period of 8 days, and more significantly, the activity itself changed character. It was no longer simply presence and passage. It became interactive. The first indication of this shift came when I discovered that items from the station itself had been moved. I maintain a careful inventory of the equipment in my assigned room. On the morning of October 23rd, I found that my journal, the one in which I had been recording personal observations about our investigation, had been removed from my bedside table and relocated to the floor beneath my window. I had locked the station door when I entered. The window was sealed. I checked for signs of forced entry and found none. Yet somehow the journal had been moved. I did not share this incident with the staff immediately. I assumed some form of distraction or misremembering on my part, the kind of oversight that occurs when sleep deprivation and stress accumulate. But that night, unable to locate mental peace, I began a systematic examination of my room for any signs of entry or disturbance. I found it on the window ledge, a mark, not a print, but a smear, as though something had pressed its hand against the glass from outside and left an impression of moisture or oil. I woke Daniel and asked him to verify what I was seeing. He examined the mark and confirmed that it appeared to be a hand impression, the palm and fingers creating the mark pattern. The hand was enormous, the span of the palm easily twice the width of my own hand. We did not sleep the remainder of that night. We sat in the common area, the lights burning bright, and attempted to process what the presence of that mark signified. Something had come to the station. Something had approached my window. Something had been aware of where I slept. The violation of that boundary, the intrusion into the space where we had assumed ourselves safe, created a fundamental shift in our psychological relationship to the situation. We were no longer observers at distance. We were subjects of observation, and that observation had become intimate. I made the decision to share this incident with the full staff. We convened a meeting in the common area, and I presented the evidence directly. I did not attempt to construct a narrative that might be more palatable. I simply told them what we had found and what we believed it signified. The responses were varied. Matthew showed little surprise. suggesting that he had begun to suspect something similar based on the accumulating disturbances. Nicole was disturbed, but not entirely disbelieving. Lauren listened quietly, and then asked me directly if I believed we were safe. I told her honestly that I did not know. Whatever intelligence was present in this landscape was demonstrating increasing boldness. The approach to my window, the movement into our station space, suggested a progression toward something. Toward what? I could not say. Lauren made the decision that we would maintain the station but would establish enhanced security protocols. We would not secure ourselves in a manner that suggested threat, as she believed that might escalate the situation. But we would ensure that the building was locked, that we would not be alone in exposed positions, and that we would establish a communication system that would allow rapid contact with emergency services if the situation escalated beyond what we could manage. Over the following days, we implemented these protocols. We also increased documentation efforts, recording activity and disturbances with the understanding that we might eventually need to present evidence that was undeniable to external authorities. On October 28th, we documented the most significant interaction yet. Nicole and Matthew had been conducting a survey in the western section of the park when they encountered direct confrontation with the creature. They described the encounter in detail upon returning to the station, still shaken but capable of coherent communication. They had been moving through an area of willow brush when the creature emerged from the vegetation ahead of them. There was no stalking quality to the emergence, no behavior suggestive of hunting. The creature simply appeared, moving into visibility with deliberate action. It was massive. Both Nicole and Matthew described it as being between 8 and 9 feet in height, with a powerfully built body covered in dark hair. The face was partially visible, features that seemed almost human in configuration but distorted, pushed into an unfamiliar shape. The eyes were what struck both of them most profoundly. Those eyes held intention. Those eyes held awareness of them as individual beings. The creature made no aggressive movement toward them. It simply stood, regarding them, in what both Nicole and Matthew described as a moment of mutual assessment. Then it made a sound, not a growl or roar, but a vocalization that seemed to contain structured quality, almost linguistic in nature. It was not words. Neither of them suggested that it was attempting language that humans would recognize, but it was communication. An attempt to convey something through vocal means. After the sound, the creature turned and moved away into the brush from which it had emerged. The entire encounter lasted perhaps 30 seconds, but something had changed in that brief exchange. The creature had demonstrated that it was capable of proximity without aggression. It had communicated in a manner that suggested meaning was being transmitted. It had established that the separation between us and it was not absolute but negotiable. That night, I sat in the station and considered what these encounters meant. We were dealing with something that was not merely inhabiting the landscape we had been assigned to protect. We were dealing with something that was aware of our presence and was attempting to establish some form of relationship or understanding with us. I did not know what that intention might be, what outcome the creature might be seeking. But I understood that we had passed a threshold. The encounters would continue. The presence would become more direct. And eventually, we would be forced to respond in a way that would define the boundaries between us and this other intelligence that had claimed the landscape of Kotzebue. The confrontation that followed was not a single violent incident, but a gradual series of escalations that fractured the cohesion of our group. Matthew became convinced that the only rational response to the creature's presence was to eliminate it. He argued, with a logic I could follow if not accept, that we were facing an unknown threat to human safety. The creature was demonstrating increasing boldness, increasing willingness to breach the physical boundaries we maintained. Eventually, he insisted, it would escalate to direct threat. We should preempt that escalation. Lauren firmly opposed any lethal action. She argued that we had no genuine understanding of the creature's intentions, that our fear was driving us toward violence rather than understanding. She insisted that we had a responsibility to protect the creature as we would any other species within the park's boundaries. Daniel occupied a middle position that seemed to satisfy no one. He believed we should document everything carefully and present the evidence to external authorities in a manner that could not be dismissed. He believed that understanding would eventually be possible, but only if we remained within the bounds of rational investigation. Rachel was increasingly unsettled by all positions. She wanted to evacuate, to leave the station and return to civilization, away from the presence that had established itself as a permanent attention in the landscape. Nicole seemed to be moving through her own process of integration. After the direct encounter with the creature, she displayed no fear. She seemed instead to be attempting to understand the experience, to process what it meant that something so entirely outside her previous understanding of the world had introduced itself into her awareness. Tensions escalated in the station. Matthew began to advocate for weapons procurement and hunting expeditions specifically intended to locate and kill the creature. Lauren resisted this actively, positioning herself between Matthew and any resources that might facilitate such action. Daniel was caught between loyalty to both of them, unable to resolve their competing positions. I attempted to maintain order, but my authority as the senior ranger investigating the situation was limited. The core staff had their own relationships and their own investment in how this situation resolved. On November 3rd, matters reached a breaking point. Matthew informed the group that he had been in contact with individuals from the town, hunters and outdoors enthusiasts who were interested in an expedition to track and pursue the creature. He had shared enough details of our documentation that they had become convinced that capturing or killing the creature was possible and would be valuable. Lauren responded by filing a formal complaint with the regional office, documenting Matthew's actions and requesting his immediate removal from the park. Matthew countered by requesting my removal, arguing that my reluctance to endorse lethal action represented a failure of duty to protect human life. The situation was careening toward institutional resolution when something shifted the entire dynamic. On the night of November 4th, the creature came to the station not as a visiting presence but as something close to a siege. We became aware of it when Rachel, unable to sleep, observed movement outside the windows. Something massive was circling the building, not rushing toward it or attempting to breach it, but moving in deliberate loops around the structure's perimeter. Daniel and I woke the others, and we gathered in the common area with lights burning. Through the windows, we could see glimpses of movement, dark shape passing through the edge of visibility. The creature was not hiding its presence. It wanted us to know it was there. The circling continued for hours. We maintained vigilance, watching the movement through windows, attempting to discern pattern or intention. As dawn approached, the creature moved away to the north, disappearing into the landscape. Matthew took this as confirmation of his position. The creature had directly threatened the station, had demonstrated hostile intent through the siege. He wanted to mount a hunting expedition immediately. He was prepared to leave the station regardless of authorization and conduct pursuit on his own. Lauren stood against this adamantly. She said the creature had not attacked, had not attempted to breach the building, had merely established its presence as a form of communication. In the midst of this argument, Nicole spoke for the first time in days regarding her own position. She said she wanted to attempt direct communication. She believed the creature was attempting to establish relationship, and the only way to move forward was to respond to that communication rather than to meet it with violence. Everyone fell silent. The idea of actually engaging the creature, of stepping outside the building and attempting to make contact, seemed to exceed every boundary we had established. But Nicole was resolute. She believed this was the necessary next step. And despite all my training, despite all my caution, I found myself agreeing with her. Lauren said if we were truly going to do this, we would do it with protocol and documentation. We would not do it as individuals, but as representatives of the Park Service. We would communicate our intent to the creature clearly, and we would establish boundaries that would be maintained. Matthew said he would not support this action, but he also said he would not attempt to stop it. He said he would remain at the station, and if the creature moved toward violence, he would respond defensively. Early on the morning of November 5th, Nicole and I walked out from the station toward the area where the creature had disappeared after the night's circling. We moved slowly, deliberately, making no attempt at concealment. We carried no weapons. We carried notebooks and cameras to document the encounter that we hoped would occur. We reached a point approximately half a mile from the station, a location that had shown previous disturbance and activity. We sat on a raised area of rock that gave us visibility across the surrounding landscape. We waited. The creature emerged from the brush to our north approximately 40 minutes after we had taken our position. It approached slowly, advancing in a direct line toward us. As it drew closer, I could see it in full daylight for the first time. It was massive, as large as the description suggested. It moved with a powerful fluidity that belied its size. The hair covering its body was dark, thick, with individual variation in color and length that created a textured appearance. The face was the most striking element, a configuration that seemed caught between human and animal categories, neither fully one nor the other. It approached until it was approximately 20 feet from us, then stopped. It lowered itself into a sitting position, mirroring our own posture. Then it began to vocalize. The sounds it made had structure and variation. They were not words, but they were not mindless noise either. There was phrasing, modulation, what seemed like intentional construction of meaning. The vocalizations went on for approximately 5 minutes, sounds continuing in patterns that seemed almost ritualistic. When it ceased vocalizing, Nicole responded. She spoke simply, slowly, using small number of words, telling the creature that we meant no harm, that we were attempting to understand. Her voice was steady and calm. The creature responded with different vocalizations. The exchange continued for perhaps 10 minutes, neither of us understanding the other's communication, but both of us engaged in the effort to establish connection across the gulf that separated us. Finally, the creature rose from its sitting position. It approached closer, until it was approximately 10 feet away. It regarded us both with intensity that I could feel as physical force. Then it moved past us, not toward us but around us, and continued its approach to the station. Nicole and I exchanged glances, then turned to follow. The creature approached the station directly. It came to the front entrance, and it pressed its hand against the door. The hand impression was enormous, fingers extended, palm flat against the solid wood. It held this contact for several seconds, then it lowered its hand and turned away. As it turned, I could see its face fully for the moment before it moved from the light. There was something in that expression that seemed almost mournful, a sorrow that did not match the power of its body. It moved away from the station toward the northeast, departing into the landscape. We watched it disappear into the brush and willow, and then it was gone. The station fell into a silence after the creature's departure. No one spoke for a long time. We sat in the common area, each of us processing what we had witnessed in the direct encounter. Matthew eventually broke the silence by saying he was leaving. He would return to the lower states. He believed we were making a mistake, that we were normalizing something that was fundamentally unnatural. But he would not attempt to stop what we were doing. He asked only that we not expect him to be part of it. He departed the following day. The remainder of November passed in a strange equilibrium. The creature did not return to the station, but its presence remained constant in the landscape. We detected evidence of its activity regularly, but it no longer approached our buildings or confronted us directly. It was as though some boundary had been established. Some understanding had been reached that neither of us fully comprehended. I remained at the station through the end of November, completing my survey responsibilities while continuing to document the creature's presence. The weather began to deteriorate as the month progressed, temperatures dropping into ranges that would make extended activity increasingly difficult for all beings. On the final day of November, I received word that my assignment rotation would be extended by 2 weeks due to early snow conditions making travel difficult. I would remain at the station and conduct additional observations through mid-December. The additional time allowed me to continue my documentation efforts with Daniel. We had accumulated an extensive catalog of photographs, GPS coordinates, behavioral observations, and physical samples. Together, we compiled this material into a comprehensive report that detailed not just the creature's presence, but the entire arc of our encounters and the progression of its behavior. When I finally prepared to leave the station on December 14th, I was uncertain what would happen to the report. Lauren said she would maintain it in her files, that she would present it to regional authorities at an appropriate time when she believed it could be received seriously. But I understood that that time might never come. The creature had become real to us, but communicating that reality to those outside our direct experience seemed nearly impossible. How could I explain encounters that pushed the boundaries of credible reality? How could I present evidence that would stand against the institutional skepticism of bureaucratic investigation? Nicole had decided to remain at the station beyond her original assignment. She said she wanted to continue attempting communication with the creature, to build on the foundation of interaction that we had established. Lauren had authorized her extended stay. On the morning I departed, Nicole walked with me to the vehicle. She said something that I have carried with me since that day. She told me that the creature was not a monster, not a threat, not even a phenomenon to be explained. It was a being, she said, with its own intelligence, its own existence in the landscape, its own purposes that might exceed our capacity to understand. She believed, she said, that it was reaching out to us, trying to establish coexistence. It was teaching us that the wilderness was not empty, that the spaces beyond civilization were not unmapped in any meaningful sense. They were inhabited, they were known, and we would have to learn to exist in relationship to that knowledge. I have thought often about Nicole's words in the years since I left Kotzebue. I have thought about the creature, about whether it is still there, still moving through the landscape, still aware of the presence of humans on the edges of its territory. I have thought about why I have not fully disclosed the details of this experience until now, and the answer is simple. I was afraid that sharing it would strip the experience of its meaning, would reduce it to the kind of spectacle and exploitation that so often accompanies the intersection of the unknown and human curiosity. But I am also aware that silence is its own form of dishonesty. The creature exists. The intelligence that inhabits the Kotzebue region is real. Those who come after me to that landscape deserve to know what walks there, what intelligence has established itself in the spaces between civilization and wilderness. I spent 22 years as a ranger across multiple assignments. I have encountered bears that carried themselves with dignity, moose that held themselves with ancient awareness, foxes that demonstrated problem-solving beyond what we typically attributed to them. I have witnessed the intelligence that suffuses the natural world, but what I encountered in Kotzebue was different in kind, not simply in degree. It was an intelligence that was attempting to communicate across the boundary that separated it from human awareness. Whether it succeeded, whether we understood even a fraction of what it was attempting to express, I cannot say with certainty. What I can say is that I am grateful for the experience. I am grateful that I was forced beyond the boundaries of what I thought I knew, that I was required to expand my categories of understanding to accommodate something that did not fit into them. I return to Kotzebue sometimes in my mind. I wonder if Nicole is still there, still attempting communication. I wonder if the creature still circles the station on nights when the moon is absent, still presses its hand against windows or doors, still leaves its presence as a kind of testimony to those who remain. I wonder if, somewhere in the wilderness of that region, that intelligence still dwells, still holds awareness of the humans on the edge of its territory, still remembers the moment when direct communication was briefly achieved before we retreated again into our separate forms of being. The official reports filed by the Park Service note no anomalies in the Kotzebue region. The expanded investigation produced no conclusive evidence of any threat or unusual activity. Standard wildlife protocols are recommended, and the park continues to operate under normal management procedures. These are the official conclusions. These are what the institutional record contains. But those of us who were present know something more. We know that the wild places beyond civilization harbor intelligences that our categories cannot contain. We know that the boundaries between our world and their world are more permeable than we typically imagine. And for those who listen with genuine attention, who allow themselves to be transformed by what they encounter, the wilderness speaks. It tells stories of presence, of persistence, of the ancient intelligence that moves through spaces we have mapped but never truly known. This is my account. This is what I witnessed. This is what I have carried since I departed the Kotzebue region in December of 2019. I encourage you to listen and to consider. I encourage you to extend your curiosity beyond the boundaries of official explanation. I encourage you to subscribe to Sir Belecho and Mr. Belecho and Mr. Geronimo for additional narratives that challenge the borders of what we believe ourselves to understand about the world we inhabit. Like this narrative, comment with your own encounters with the unknown. Share your experiences of the wild and what wisdom the wilderness has offered you. The story does not end with my departure. The story continues in the landscape of Kotzebue. It continues in the awareness of those who remain at the station. It continues in the intelligence that has established itself as a permanent presence in that region. We are all part of this ongoing story. whether we acknowledge it or not. I never expected to find myself in a place so remote that the world's noise ceased to exist. My name is Christopher Anderson, and for 44 years I believed I understood the wilderness. I was wrong. The assignment came through our organization in late August. We were studying the ecosystem patterns in Kotzebue, Alaska, a small community nestled where the Chukchi and Kotzebue Sound waters meet the frozen tundra. 5 of us were selected for the expedition. Lauren Thomas, 61 years old, led our environmental team. She had worked in Arctic research for decades and carried herself with the confidence of someone who had walked through nature's harshest territories. Daniel Taylor, 50 years old, handled our equipment and logistics. He was methodical, quiet, the kind of person who double-checked everything. Rachel Moore, 35, was our youngest member. She possessed an energy that seemed out of place in such a desolate landscape, yet her sharp observations made her invaluable. Matthew Jackson, 42, served as our communication specialist, though his equipment rarely functioned properly in that region. Nicole Martin, 58, documented everything: the land, the animals, the weather patterns. She was thorough to the point of obsession. We arrived on the 18th of September. The sun hung low in the sky even at midday, casting everything in shades of amber and gray. Kotzebue revealed itself gradually. First, the smell, salt water mixed with something older, something that seemed to come from the permafrost itself. Then the structures, weathered buildings that had survived decades of Arctic wind, their paint stripped down to bare wood. The people of Kotzebue moved with purpose, never leisurely. They knew something about the land that outsiders did not. Our base camp sat 7 miles northeast of the town proper, positioned near a ridge that overlooked the tundra valley. The cabin we rented was a solid structure, built to withstand extremes. Thick logs formed its walls. A massive stone fireplace dominated one end of the main room. Lauren had arranged everything meticulously. We would conduct our research during daylight hours, collect our samples, monitor the animal migrations, and return before darkness consumed the landscape. On our first evening, as we prepared our equipment, Nicole pulled out her documentation materials. She was the type of person who recorded everything: voice memos, written notes, photographs, temperature readings. As she organized her materials on the wooden table, she mentioned something that would later seem prophetic. "The locals asked about our research focus," Nicole said, adjusting her glasses. "I told them we were studying ecosystem changes. The woman at the supply store looked at me with an expression I cannot quite describe. Then she said, 'If you go into the valley, go during daylight only. Never stay after the sun begins to set.' I asked her why, but she would not explain further." Matthew chuckled from across the room. "Fear of the dark. Every small community has those stories." Lauren did not respond immediately. She continued reviewing our data collection protocols, but I noticed her jaw tighten slightly. She had heard something in Nicole's recounting that troubled her. "The Inupiat people have lived in this region for thousands of years," Lauren said finally. "If they express caution about certain areas, we would be wise to heed that advice, regardless of why they offer it." Daniel began checking our tracking equipment, his movements economical and precise. "We follow protocol. We stay within established parameters. We return before sunset. Simple." Rachel looked up from her laptop, where she had been reviewing topographical maps. "What if the stories are based on something real? Not superstition, but observation. People might not understand why something is dangerous, but generations of experience teach them to avoid it." I found myself studying each of them. 5 intelligent people, each with their own certainty about how the world operated. Lauren's certainty came from science and experience. Daniel's came from procedure and discipline. Rachel's came from critical thinking. Matthew's confidence was rooted in skepticism. Nicole's trust resided in documentation and evidence. We were all wrong about what we would find. The next morning, we ventured into the valley for the first time. The tundra stretched before us like a frozen ocean that had somehow become earth. Moss and low vegetation covered the ground in shades of brown and dull green. Rocks of various sizes protruded from the surface, scattered as if by a careless giant. The air held a quality I had never experienced, a clarity that made distant mountains appear close enough to touch, yet somehow emphasized how isolated we truly were. We worked methodically. Daniel established our baseline measurements. Rachel collected soil samples. Matthew monitored temperature and air quality. Nicole photographed everything, her camera clicking continuously. Lauren moved between us, checking our work, adjusting our parameters, ensuring we maintained proper documentation. By midday, we had established our primary research site and installed several monitoring stations. As we prepared to return to base camp, Rachel noticed something unusual near an outcropping of rocks to the north. "There are marks on these rocks," she called to us. "Deep gouges, recent. Look at how the edges have not oxidized." We gathered around the stone face. The marks were undeniable. Long, parallel scratches that ran vertically down the rock surface. They were too large to have been made by any small animal, too deep to be casual marks. Lauren examined them with her gloved hand, measuring the distance between the gouges. "Could be from equipment," Matthew suggested. "Previous researchers or surveying teams." "No equipment creates marks like this," Lauren said quietly. "These were made by something with claws, something large." Nicole was already photographing the marks from multiple angles, noting their location and measurements. "The town woman's warning," she said without looking up from her camera. "Maybe these marks are why they suggested staying away." We returned to base camp as the light began its transition from amber to orange. Daniel prepared a meal while the rest of us organized our findings. The marks we had discovered occupied our conversation. Speculation filled the cabin, bear claws perhaps, or wolf. Lauren seemed unconvinced by either explanation, but she offered no alternative theory. That night, I stood on the cabin's small porch, watching the darkness approach. The Arctic sky transitioned through colors I had no names for, crimson fading to deep purple, then to blue, then to the profound darkness of far northern night. The temperature dropped rapidly once the sun disappeared. Within minutes, the thermometer visible through the window read -8 degrees. The wind carried a sound with it, a faint howling that might have been distant as mountain peaks or dangerously close. I heard movement inside the cabin. The others were settling into their sleeping areas. We had agreed on a schedule, watches through the night, though we had thought at the time that such precautions were merely professional diligence. No one truly expected anything to occur. The howling continued, rising and falling with the wind. I pulled my coat tighter and went inside. Sleep came slowly. My dreams were filled with the image of those claw marks, deep and purposeful, scored into stone with a strength that seemed almost personal in its intensity. The second day brought overcast skies and a temperature that never rose above zero. The sky hung low and gray, pressing down on the tundra as if the heavens themselves had descended to examine us more closely. We ventured further into the valley, moving north beyond where we had established our first site. Daniel marked our path methodically, placing bright orange flags every 100 meters so that we could navigate back. Rachel seemed energized by the expanded research area, moving quickly despite the heavy terrain. Matthew struggled slightly with the cold. He was not acclimated to Arctic conditions the way Lauren was. Nicole continued her endless documentation, her camera and recorder both running nearly all the time. It was Matthew who found the first track. "Here," he called out, his voice strained from breathing in cold air. "Come look at this." We converged on his location. The print was massive, far larger than any human footprint. It was pressed deep into the soft moss and ground, suggesting considerable weight. The shape was unmistakably a foot, 5 toes, each with a distinct impression, a heel pad. The size alone suggested a creature somewhere between 7 and 8 feet in height. "Bigfoot," Rachel whispered, though I think she meant it as a question rather than a statement. "Print preservation suggests this is recent," Lauren said, crouching beside it. "Within the last day, perhaps. The edges have not degraded significantly, and the ground is still somewhat compressed around the impression." Nicole was photographing the track from multiple angles, recording measurements. "The depth of the impression is remarkable. The weight distribution suggests a bipedal gait with significant muscle mass." Daniel was looking north, along the trail the tracks seemed to follow. "There are more," he said. "A line of them, heading toward the ridge." We followed the tracks. They were spaced roughly 3 to 4 feet apart, the stride of something large and tall. The prints became more frequent as we moved forward, clustering and dispersing in patterns that seemed to follow the contours of the land rather than any human logic of pathfinding. The tracks led us to a small ravine that cut through the tundra valley. The walls of the ravine were perhaps 30 feet deep, creating a natural shelter or corridor. The prints descended the slope and disappeared into the shadows of the ravine's floor. "We should document this location and return to base camp," Lauren said, her voice carrying an edge that I had not heard before. "We can analyze these findings, establish protocols for—" "There is something else," Rachel interrupted. She was pointing to a section of the ravine's wall about 15 feet up the slope. Large sections of bark had been stripped from a stunted willow tree. The exposed wood was raw, pale, recent. Claw marks surrounded the stripped area. Deep, deliberate gouges in the ancient wood. "Feeding behavior or territorial marking," Nicole murmured. "The pattern suggests the creature deliberately removed the bark, either for food or for the act of leaving its mark on the landscape." We stood at the edge of the ravine, looking down into shadow. The wind that moved through the depression carried a smell that was not quite animal, not quite earth. Something else. Something that made the hair on the back of my neck rise despite the cold that should have already made such a response impossible. "We returned to base camp," Lauren said, her tone leaving no room for discussion. "We have documented sufficient evidence for today. We analyze, we develop tomorrow's research parameters, and we move forward cautiously." The walk back seemed longer than the journey out. The light was already declining as we approached the cabin. The temperature had fallen further, and the wind had picked up intensity. Daniel reported that the thermometer now read -15 degrees. The sky carried the particular quality that Arctic weather sometimes possessed, the sense that conditions might deteriorate rapidly without warning. We spent the evening analyzing our findings. Nicole's photographs were crisp and detailed. Our measurements were consistent and thorough. The evidence was undeniable. We had discovered tracks that could not be easily explained by any known Arctic fauna. Lauren studied the photographs for hours, her expression growing more troubled as the evening progressed. "These dimensions do not match any known animal native to Alaska," Lauren said finally. "The bipedal locomotion, the hand structure visible in some of the prints, the size, all of these characteristics are consistent with documented reports of Sasquatch sightings across North America." "You are suggesting the creature is Bigfoot," Matthew said. There was no skepticism in his voice anymore. Fear had replaced it. "I am suggesting that what we have found deserves serious consideration and careful investigation," Lauren replied. "I am not drawing conclusions. I am stating what the evidence shows us." Rachel was reviewing the images of the claw marks we had discovered earlier, comparing them to the tracks. The spacing between the claw marks on the rocks is consistent with the hand impressions visible in some of the tracks. It is the same creature, the same individual, possibly, given the consistency of the print sizes. Nicole was transcribing her voice recordings, her fingers moving quickly over her keyboard. "I have documented the location, the size, the print pattern, the behavior evidence. Tomorrow we return to the ravine and extend our documentation. We establish a perimeter observation camp if possible." "Absolutely not," Daniel said flatly. "We document what we have found. We report to appropriate authorities. We leave." "And tell them what?" Matthew asked. "That we found tracks that might be a cryptid? They will remove us from our research positions and label us as unreliable." I had not spoken since we returned to the cabin. My role in our group was observer and recorder. I gathered information and attempted to find patterns in others' behavior and assumptions. What I observed now was that fear was a remarkable transformer. It changed how people thought, how they prioritized, how they perceived risk and reward. "We vote," Lauren said. "Do we continue the investigation as planned, or do we conclude our work and return to Kotzebue?" The vote was not unanimous. Daniel and Matthew wanted to leave. Lauren, Rachel, and Nicole wanted to continue. I abstained, claiming that as an observer, I should not influence the direction of the group. In truth, I was afraid of whatever might result from either decision. We stayed. That night, the sounds outside the cabin intensified. The howling I had heard the previous evening returned, but now it was accompanied by other noises, deep grunts that seemed to resonate through the walls, the sound of something moving through the scrubland beyond our perimeter. Matthew lay awake in his sleeping area, his breathing shallow and rapid. Rachel seemed oddly calm, though I noticed her hand resting on a heavy flashlight. as if she might need a weapon should something force its way inside. Nicole stood at the cabin window, watching the darkness beyond the reach of our external lights. Her camera was in her hands, though there was nothing to photograph. "It knows we are here," she said quietly. "It has circled the cabin twice in the last hour. I can hear its breathing." Lauren sat at the table, still reviewing photographs. "We will establish a protocol for tomorrow. We will move more carefully. We will not venture as far. We will maintain constant awareness of our surroundings." "It is aware of our surroundings," Nicole replied. "It knows this territory far better than we do. If it chooses to approach, we will have no advantage." The morning of the third day broke gray and cold. The thermometer outside read -22 degrees. The wind had shifted direction during the night, now carrying the smell of the ocean mixed with something else, something musky and thick that seemed to coat the back of the throat. Daniel prepared breakfast mechanically, his movements suggesting he had slept very little. Matthew looked diminished somehow, as if fear had taken physical weight from him. Rachel was focused and alert, while Nicole continued her documentation with an obsessive quality that suggested she was using the work to manage her own anxiety. Lauren announced that she wanted to move to the ravine we had discovered, but she wanted to do so by a different route. She wanted to study the creature's behavior patterns based on the tracks we had found. She wanted to understand how it moved, where it hunted, what might draw it into different sections of the valley. "We are searching for behavioral predictability," she explained. "If we understand its patterns, we can increase our safety margin, or we increase our risk by moving deeper into its territory," Daniel countered. But Lauren's will prevailed, as it always did. We gathered our equipment and prepared to move out. The walk to the ravine took longer than it had the previous day because Lauren wanted us to move more carefully, to document any tracks or signs we encountered. The snow from the previous night had covered much of the ground, but evidence of the creature's presence was unmistakable. We found tracks everywhere, some heading toward the ravine, some away from it, all suggesting a pattern of constant movement through the valley. We reached the ravine by midday. The light was already beginning its decline toward afternoon. We installed additional monitoring equipment, motion sensors that would hopefully capture any activity, temperature gauges that would register the presence of large animals, recording devices that might capture sounds. Rachel moved to the base of the ravine, studying the stripped bark on the willow more carefully. "This is not recent," she said, running her hand along the exposed wood. "The edges are starting to harden. This happened days ago, perhaps a week ago." Nicole was at the ravine's other side, examining a second stripped tree. "Here also, multiple instances. This is a regular behavior, not a one-time event." It was Matthew who noticed the cave. The entrance was partially concealed by an overhang of rock and weathered vegetation. It was perhaps 4 feet tall and 3 feet wide, small enough that a human would need to crouch to enter, but large enough for something significantly bigger to squeeze through without much difficulty. "There is a den nearby," Matthew said, his voice carrying a tremor. "Whatever made those tracks lives in this ravine." Lauren approached the cave entrance with the kind of caution one might show when approaching a live electrical wire. She did not attempt to enter. She simply observed, studying the ground near the opening, looking for more tracks, more evidence of habitation. "Scratches on the rocks surrounding the entrance," she noted. "Regular use. The cave walls have been marked deliberately. This is definitely a shelter location." "We leave now," Daniel said. His voice carried no room for negotiation. "We have our evidence. We document it, and we leave this valley." "We have our evidence of presence," Lauren corrected. "We do not have evidence of active habituation. We do not know if this den is currently in use or if it is abandoned." "There is one way to determine that," Nicole said quietly. "Absolutely not," Daniel and Matthew said simultaneously. "Not tonight," Rachel added. "But tomorrow, we could watch the cave, set up observation points at a distance, record any activity." "And if the creature emerges while we are watching?" Daniel asked. "Then we run," Rachel replied simply. "We have the capability to move faster than something so large, at least for short distances." The argument continued as we returned to the cabin. The sky was already darkening. The temperature continued to fall. Daniel insisted we had conducted sufficient research. Lauren was adamant that we continue. Matthew wanted to leave immediately, Rachel and Nicole supported continuing. I remained quiet, observing, documenting in my mind the way crisis revealed who people really were beneath their professional veneer. That night, the sounds outside the cabin ceased completely. The silence was somehow more disturbing than the howling and movement of the previous nights. It suggested awareness, intention, calculation. The creature was no longer advertising its presence. It was watching us. Matthew did not sleep. He sat in a chair near the window, his eyes fixed on the darkness outside. Rachel seemed almost tranquil, as if she had accepted whatever might come and found peace in that acceptance. Nicole continued to work, updating her documentation, organizing her photographs, speaking quietly into her recorder. Lauren stood beside me as I looked out at the starless night. "I should have told you from the beginning," Lauren said. "This was not my first expedition into remote territories where Sasquatch sightings had been reported. I have been hunting for evidence of this creature for 20 years. I turned to look at her. Her face was illuminated by the cabin's dim interior light, shadows emphasizing the lines of age and exhaustion. "That is why you were chosen for this expedition," she continued. "That is why I selected each person on this team. You were each chosen because I believed you could handle what we might find." "A creature that may not exist," I said. "A creature that may not be known to exist," Lauren corrected. "The difference is significant." Dawn came late to Kotzebue, the sun rising for only a brief period before beginning its descent once more. We gathered our equipment in silence. The decision had been made the previous evening. We would move to the ravine and establish an observation post at a distance from the cave. We would watch and document for as long as the daylight permitted. The walk to the ravine seemed to take less time than before, as if fear had somehow compressed the landscape. The temperature had risen slightly to -15 degrees, but the wind carried new intensity. The sky was the color of old bruises, purple and blue and black all at once. Daniel had prepared surveillance equipment, cameras with motion activation, thermal imaging devices that might register the heat signature of a large animal. We positioned these at various points around the ravine, establishing a perimeter of observation. Rachel chose a position on a ridge that overlooked the cave entrance. Matthew remained with Daniel at a secondary observation point closer to our base camp. Lauren, Nicole, and I positioned ourselves where we could see the ravine entrance while maintaining distance from the cave itself. For the first 3 hours, nothing occurred. The equipment recorded the wind and the subtle movements of Arctic vegetation. The thermal cameras showed no heat signatures. The motion sensors detected only our own movements as we shifted position to manage the cold. Then, around midday, the character of the day changed. The wind died down. The sky cleared slightly, allowing actual daylight to penetrate the ravine more fully. The temperature seemed to fluctuate, rising and falling as if something was affecting the air itself. Nicole detected it first. "There," she said, pointing to the area near the cave entrance. "Movement." A shape that resolved itself into something massive and dark as it emerged from the shadows. It was enormous, easily 7 feet tall, perhaps 8. Its body was covered in hair that appeared nearly black in the pale light. It moved with surprising grace for something so large, each step deliberate and measured. Its shoulders were massive, the musculature evident even beneath the thick covering of fur. It was not simply an animal. There was intelligence in how it moved, purposefulness in how it examined its surroundings. It turned its head slowly, as if scenting the air. I realized with a cold certainty that it knew we were present. It had known all along. Lauren raised her camera with trembling hands. The shutter clicked, capturing images of something that should not exist. Something that contradicted everything we claimed to understand about the natural world. The creature walked away from the cave, moving toward the ravine's opposite side. It moved with the fluid power of something perfectly adapted to its environment. Periodically, it would bend and examine the ground, seemingly searching for something. We watched in stunned silence as it moved with purpose through the tundra valley. Then it stopped. It turned. It looked directly in our direction, not generally in our direction, directly, as if it knew exactly where we were hidden. "It sees us," Matthew said through our communication devices. His voice was barely a whisper. "Oh God, it sees us." The creature began walking toward our position. Each step was deliberate. There was no rush, no aggression in its movement, Simply approach. Steady, inevitable approach. Lauren stood. I do not know what she intended, whether she wanted to run or stand her ground or attempt communication. The moment she became fully visible, the creature accelerated. Its pace transformed from a walk to something that was not quite a run but was infinitely more terrifying. It closed the distance with frightening speed. Rachel's voice came through the communications device. Run, now, back to camp. Run. We ran. Or, rather, we attempted to run across terrain that was never intended for human speed. The frozen ground cracked beneath our feet. The scattered rocks seemed to reach up and catch at our progress. Behind us, the sound of the creature moving was like an avalanche in living form, heavy and relentless and absolutely unstoppable. Daniel had begun running from his position as well. Matthew was moving with surprising speed for someone so frightened. We were scattered across the tundra, each of us driven by a primal need to reach the cabin and the false safety it represented. I did not stop to look behind me. Forward momentum was all that mattered. The cabin appeared gradually as we crested a low rise. The door stood open. Daniel must have left it unlocked in anticipation of exactly this scenario. We crashed through the entrance. Daniel slammed the door shut and threw the bolt. The sound of the creature striking the outside wall came moments later. It was an impact that shook the entire structure, that suggested something of immense power and force had made contact with the building. Then silence. The creature did not attempt to force entry. It did not attack the door or break through a window. It simply remained. We could hear it circling the cabin, its breathing heavy and labored. Occasionally there was the sound of it striking a wall or scraping against the structure, but nothing that suggested an attempt to breach our shelter. Nicole moved to the window, her camera ready. I could see the creature's massive form passing by the exterior light, 12 feet tall, possibly taller. Its fur was not the black I had initially perceived, but a dark brown that appeared nearly black in the limited light. Its arms hung to below its knees. Its head was massive, with a pronounced brow ridge and a face that was not quite human, but contained enough human characteristics to trouble the mind. "We are trapped," Matthew said. His voice was hollow, defeated. "No," Lauren said firmly. "We are safe. The structure is sound. We have supplies. We can remain here until—" She did not finish because the creature released a sound from outside. It was not a roar or a howl or any vocalization I had ever heard from any living creature. It was a combination of all three, a sound that seemed to contain rage and sorrow, and something that might almost have been communication. The sun was already descending. We had perhaps 4 hours of light remaining. The creature remained outside as darkness approached, circling constantly, making that sound periodically, a sound that seemed to express something beyond mere animal hunger. As night fell completely, the creature fell silent. It was still outside. We could hear its breathing when we pressed our ears against the walls, but it no longer vocalized. It simply waited. "It is testing us," Rachel said. She was watching the ravine through a pair of binoculars. "Or perhaps it is waiting for something, an opportunity, the right moment." "To do what?" Daniel asked. "To what end?" No one answered. We did not know. We could only observe and document and wait, just as the creature waited outside in the Arctic darkness. Nicole continued recording throughout the night. She documented our conversations, our fears, our observations of the creature's behavior. She was doing what she had been trained to do, gathering evidence, creating a record of events, ensuring that whatever occurred would not be forgotten. Dawn came after what felt like an eternity. The creature was still there. We found its tracks in the snow that had fallen during the night, countless circuits of the cabin, paths that showed it had paced the entire perimeter repeatedly, but it made no move to attack as daylight returned. We were aware that we could not remain indefinitely. Our supplies would last perhaps another week if we were conservative. We had communication equipment, though our attempts to transmit had failed mysteriously. Matthew theorized that the creature somehow was interfering with the signal, though none of us understood how such a thing could be possible. On the fourth day, the creature stopped circling. It simply lay down on the snow near the cabin's east wall, its massive form visible through the windows. It was resting, but its eyes remained open, fixed on the cabin entrance. Lauren made a decision. She would attempt to walk to Kotzebue. She would bring back help. The creature would not pursue, she reasoned, if only one of us left the group. It seemed to be displaying some form of intelligence, some form of purpose beyond simple hunger. We argued against it. Daniel insisted he should be the one to leave. Rachel offered to go. Matthew was too frightened to consider it. Nicole could not leave. Her documentation equipment was too extensive to move alone. Lauren left as midday approached. She walked directly toward the creature, expecting that it would allow her passage. For a moment, it seemed that her theory might be correct. The creature lifted its head, watching her approach. Then, with startling speed, it rose to its feet. Lauren ran. She abandoned the direct path to Kotzebue and instead ran south, toward the ravine. The creature pursued her, not with the focused determination it had shown when chasing us back to the cabin, but with something that seemed almost playful. It was herding her, driving her toward the ravine and the cave beyond. We watched through the windows as Lauren disappeared into the ravine. The creature followed. For several minutes there was no sound, no movement. Then the creature emerged from the ravine's upper slope and walked back toward the cabin. It assumed its resting position against the east wall. Lauren did not return. That night, huddled in the cabin, we made a choice. We would stay through the next day and the next night, maintaining our documentation and observation. We would attempt the transmission one more time in the morning. We would then attempt to reach Kotzebue individually or in pairs, using different routes, attempting to overwhelm any threat through numbers and diversity of approach. Before dawn, Nicole handed me her recording device. She had transferred all of her documentation to it. The photographs, the audio recordings, the measurements and observations, everything we had gathered about the creature in the ravine. "If you get out," she said, "you make sure people know. You make sure people understand. We were not crazy. We were not seeing things. This is real." I took the device and placed it in an inner pocket of my jacket. Matthew was first to attempt escape. He ran directly south, away from Kotzebue, away from all settlements. The creature did not follow. It watched him run until he disappeared over a distant rise, then returned to its resting position. Rachel went next, moving north toward the distant lights of Kotzebue that were just barely visible on clear nights. The creature rose as she approached the edge of our camp but did not pursue. It simply watched her go. Daniel attempted a western route the following morning. He made it perhaps 2 miles before returning to the cabin on his own. He did not speak when he entered. He simply sat in a chair and stared at nothing. Nicole attempted to leave in the afternoon of the 5th day. The creature intervened with a gentleness that was somehow more terrifying than violence would have been. It placed itself between Nicole and the direction of the town, but it did not attack. It simply stood there, blocking passage, until Nicole retreated back to the cabin. On the 6th day, a rescue team arrived from Kotzebue. Matthew had successfully reached the town and reported our situation. Armed personnel and experienced Arctic search and rescue teams came to extract us. The creature was gone by the time they arrived. There were tracks circling the cabin, massive and clear. There was blood on the snow, human blood, and evidence of disturbance near the ravine. But the creature itself had vanished into the wilderness. They found Lauren's body 2 days later, at the edge of the ravine's cave entrance. She was positioned carefully, almost gently, as if she had been placed there rather than abandoned. Her equipment was missing, her research notes were gone. We were extracted from Kotzebue on the 7th day. I brought Nicole's recordings with me, as promised. Daniel, Matthew, Rachel, and I returned to civilization with our surviving documentation and our impossible story. The authorities investigated. They found no evidence of an unidentified creature. The tracks were dismissed as environmental disturbance. Our testimony was politely documented and then dismissed as trauma-induced confusion. Lauren Thomas's death was attributed to exposure and disorientation. Her body bore no marks of violence. Nothing about her death suggested anything other than an accident in the harsh Arctic wilderness. I have kept Nicole's recordings. I have never released them to the authorities or to any institution. I have kept them because they represent something I cannot fully explain. Evidence of something that our understanding of the world insists cannot exist, yet which walked through that Arctic valley with purpose and intelligence and something that might have been sadness. The creature of the tundra remains unexplained. It may still inhabit that ravine. It may have moved on to other territories. But I know what I saw. I know what we documented. I know that in the valley near Kotzebue, where ancient cliffs overlook frozen ground, there exists something that science has not yet learned to acknowledge. Sometimes I wonder if Lauren understood that from the beginning. If she had not come to Kotzebue to find evidence of the creature's existence but to meet with it, to make contact with something ancient and aware and utterly beyond our comprehension. I will carry that question with me for the rest of my life.